Greetings, everyone. Here we are for our last session. It's kind of sad. I'm enjoying this, but time marches on, and we'll be on to another subject in the fall with the Great War, and then after that, round 2 of Dickens. So without further ado, let's begin. So Dickens England, Part 1, Conclusion. This is a famous painting, and it really goes past our time frame, but I think it's a great way to end and to, again, feature one of Dickens's greatest strengths, which of course is characterization. Illustration is important to Dickens, and it's certainly one of the things that he helps to innovate. There were 2 methods for illustrations to be placed in a book or newspaper. The most common, and the one that had been around the longest, is what you see pictured at your right here, the wood engraved block. And I actually have this block, so let me stop my share for a minute and show you. This would be a 1/4 page illustration. Some would be bigger to 1/2, although none of Dickens's illustrations were 1/2, and then a full page, particularly if it was for a newspaper. But you can see the size. Most of the time, illustrations for Dickens would look like this. So wood engraving block, and just note the fine line in here. It takes a small little knife. You saw the size of the block, and to cut in to make this illustration work. And please note, it had to be backwards, which adds some extra challenge to it. Most of the artists did not engrave. There's a few, but most depended on another person who obviously had the same kind of skill to create such a block. The new technology was being called lithography. And it involved the use of a grease pencil or grease ink to draw on a piece of sandstone or metal plate, which was then fixed to the plate with an acid bath. Here's an actual example of a sandstone block. This one approximately the same size as the wood block that I was holding just a second ago. Illustration was an essential part of the Dickens experience. And Cruikshank, pictured here on your left, was Dickens's first illustrator for sketches by Boz and then Oliver Twist. After that, he was using other illustrators because Cruikshank was in high demand, probably the top illustrator at that time, and had plenty of other work to do. Dickens worked in close collaboration with his illustrators, supplying them with an overall summary of the work at the outset for the cover. He then briefed the illustrator on plans for each month's installment so that work on the 2 illustrations could begin before he wrote the individual chapters for each installment. A reminder that each installment was monthly, and it contained 3 chapters, and within those 3 chapters, there would be 2 illustrations between the 3 chapters. The author had complete control over the artist's work, including the ability to decline a specific illustration. And if you recall last week, I showed you Cruikshank's original last illustration for Twist, which Dickens rejected because it was too reminiscent for him of Mary Hogarth. And so they came up with the illustration, which you actually see in your book if you're reading it. Okay, so just a reminder, in this course, we were covering, the years of his birth, 1812 to end in 1849, and so here are the last few years within the time frame of this first course. We left him last time in Italy with Catherine and his family. Here in 45, he's still there, and now he and Catherine are traveling around Italy. They will return in 1846. He will write his second travelogue, the first being, of course, the American Notes, and now Pictures from Italy. as a result of his travels, and a short title, not a novel, called The Battle of Life. But he also begins his monthly serialization of Dombey and Son, which is, I would argue, for my own personal taste, a real breakthrough novel for him. In 1847, his seventh child is born, and Dickens performs in amateur theatricals in both Manchester and Liverpool, plus all the other work he's been doing as an editor. In 1848, he continues to perform with amateur theater productions, but now he's even going to Ireland and Scotland in addition throughout England. Plus he writes another short work, The Haunted Man. And of course, 1848 is huge in European history because of the revolutions of 1848 that are breaking out all over the continent. And in 1849, our last year of coverage here, his eighth child is born, and monthly serialization of David Copperfield begins. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, Doc asked the question about defining moments in Twist and in his poem. And so I'm using that here to say, did the events of 1848 provide a defining moment? I mean, there's, here are four major things that are occurring in this year. Monster Chartist rally in Kensington Park, London. I actually showed a photograph of this in our first week. The Great Famine in Ireland is peaking. This is the year that they will begin to arrive, the Irish will begin to arrive in the United States. And Marx and Engels publishes Communist Manifesto in London. And of course, the revolutions of 1848 that are now threatening the status quo of Europe. Charles Trevelyan, an important English historian who we'll actually be looking at in the next course, says this about 1848. 1848 was the turning point upon which the world did not turn. So obviously he has his opinion. Here's a map that shows where things are breaking out, trouble. And some of it looks standard, of course, France, Spain, but there is no Germany yet. There aren't the other smaller countries. This is the remnants, if you follow my cursor, of what was being called for many hundreds of years the Holy Roman Empire. But it's being broken up now between, roughly speaking, the Kingdom of Prussia, although it's a very rough title, it's not all that accurate, more accurate, the Austrian Empire, which is led by the Habsburgs. There is no Italy. It's a series of states. And of course, the big boy in the East is the Russian Empire. Certainly a timely thing to note here, because the Russian Empire, the Tsars, are supporting the counter-revolution against the revolutionaries. And they will send arms and equipment and military in to support the Habsburgs in Austria. And they will also incur into the Ottoman Empire, which is run by the Turks at this point. And these two areas today would roughly be Romania and Bulgaria. You note that the Russian Empire has the Crimea Peninsula and Ukraine in here. Clearly, though, there is a disruption of the conservative old order. The disruption of absolute monarchy by the forces of liberalism, radicalism, socialism, and nationalism. These are the main ideas that were attacking autocracy for various reasons. In no way do they share necessarily the same goals. An unlikely coalition of various middle-class groups, reformers, radicals, nationalists, working class, and university students rose up against the autocratic forces driven by the ideals of liberalism, radicalism, socialism, and nationalism. The problem here is that there is little to no coordination between the groups or regions, and it's going to be easy, therefore, for the autocratic or counter-revolutionary forces to strike back and hold them off. But the old order failed to erase the social and political ideas that would continue to percolate in various forms throughout the European continent. In our next course, you'll see the results of that. So the destabilizing Russian bear, again, an appropriate comment for today, was certainly just that back at this time. We'll look at a war that they're going to pretty much start in the next session. And here, note that the honeybee hives look like mosques. And that's because of their attack, the Russian attack into the Ottoman Empire. And if you look closely at the bees, they actually are Ottoman Turks. So the bear and the bees, a new version of an old story. And we could certainly substitute the Ottoman Empire for Ukraine today. So, we've talked about autobiography within Dickens's writing. And so is there realism behind Dickens' melodrama? And these are 5 examples that would answer the question with yes. The birth of Oliver and the death of his mother and the opening of Twist coincided with the birth of Dickens's first child, Charlie, which proved to be a difficult delivery for Catherine Dickens. The baby farm that Mrs. Mann runs in Twist appears right after the scandal of an infant death on a farm in St. James, Westminster, had been reported in 1837. Magistrate Fang, who we've talked about before, was based upon a ruthless police magistrate described to Dickens by a police source. Dickens's own abandonment influenced Oliver's travails throughout Twist. And the character of Rose Maylie was created following the death of Mary Hogarth, which we talked about last time too. So clearly, autobiography filters in through much of Dickens's writing, not just Oliver Twist. So Dombey and Son, a new serialization for him. Full title is Dealings with the Firm of Dombey and Son, Wholesale, Retail, and for Exportation. Dickens began his 7th novel's serialization while in Switzerland, but completed it back in England. And the initial plot is focused upon Paul Dombey, wealthy owner of a shipping company, whose dream, and obsession really, is to have a son to continue his business. Dombey and Son is one of my 3 favorite Dickens novels. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. And I wrote this little piece in support of that. Dombey and Son is Dickens's first great novel. Dickens said of Dombey and Son at the time that it was published that he thought it would be remembered as one of his best works. It was only his 7th novel. It is mostly about Paul Dombey's refusal to recognize and return his daughter's love that she consistently gives him. The novel is also about pride and ambition. Paul Dombey, owner of a successful and powerful shipping company, is proud, wealthy, arrogant, and frigid. His one purpose in life is to have a son and see that he inherits the business. He has ignored his previously born daughter, Florence Dombey. And when his son dies at a very young age, he continues to ignore Florence. Dickens only wrote 2 novels that feature a heroine, and Florence, made courageous by the death of her mother and the neglect of her proud, rich father, is an altogether sprightly protagonist. Dombey and Son has all the comedy and satirical indignation of his earlier fiction, but it also features new shades of darkness and more narrative complexity. It has also been called Dickens's railroad novel because the new technology is featured in Dombey and Son. Dickens wonders aloud whether or not the railroad's technological progress poses a threat to the Victorians' notions of the family. In ways, Dickens seems to see the railroad in an apocalyptic manner. Last class, I mentioned a quote from Peter Ackroyd, one of Dickens's biographers, and it was about whenever things begin to slow down too much in a novel, Dickens tends to throw a baby on the fire to raise the heat. So here in Dombey and Son, again, it happens. Paul, his young son, is born sickly and dies at a very young age. And here's a quote from chapter 11. It's about Paul, the son. He sat with folded hands upon his pedestal, silently listening, but he might have answered, weary, weary, very lonely, very sad. And there, with an aching void in his young heart, and all outside so cold and bare and strange, Paul sat as if he had taken life unfurnished, and the upholsterer were never coming. I think that's a great line, that last sentence. Edith Dombey is Paul Dombey's wife. It's not a marriage made in heaven by any means. She's an interesting character. She will turn on Paul Dombey. In fact, she doesn't really want to ever marry him. And she will actually run away with Mr. Carker. Mr. Carker had been Paul Dombey's right-hand man. And Dombey relied upon him and trusted him. And then, of course, Carker all the way is stealing money and stabbing him in the back. And this quote is from Edith, directed at Mr. Carker, although it just as well could have been directed at her husband, Paul Dombey. If I dropped a tear upon your hand, may it wither it up. If I spoke a gentle word in your hearing, may it deafen you. If I touched you with my lips, may the touch be poison to you. A curse upon this roof that gave me shelter. Sorrow and shame upon your head. Ruin upon all belonging to you. Clearly, she was upset with Mr. Carker. She didn't love him either. And of course, Paul Dombey Sr. himself. The first quote from the novel is an apt description of Dombey. The stark fire irons appeared to claim a nearer relationship than anything else there to Mr. Dombey. And towards the end of the novel, Dombey finally realizes the love that his daughter has for him, that she has never given up on him, even though he never loved her. He thought of her as she had been that night when he and his bride came home. He thought of her as she had been in all the home events of the abandoned house. He thought now that of all around him, she alone had never changed. His boy had faded into dust. His proud wife had sunk into a polluted creature. His flatterer and friend had been transformed into the worst of villains. His riches had melted away. The very walls that sheltered him looked on him as a stranger. She alone had turned the same mild, gentle look upon him always. Yes, to the latest and the last. She had never changed to him, nor had he ever changed to her, and she was lost. Forster, Dickens's close friend, wrote this about the Dombey and Son. An elderly charwoman employed about the place had shown so much sympathy in the family trouble that Mrs. Hogarth especially told her of the approaching visit and who it was that was coming to the sick room. "Lawk, Mom," she said, "is the young gentleman upstairs the son of the man that put together Dombey?" Reassured upon this point, she exclaimed her question by declaring that she never thought there was a man that could have put together Dombey. Being pressed farther as to what her notion was of this mystery of a Dombey, for it was known that she could not read, it turned out that she lodged at a snuff shop kept by a person named Douglas, where there were several other lodgers, and that on the first Monday of every month there was a tea, and the landlord read the month's number of Dombey, those only of the lodgers who subscribed to the tea partaking of that luxury, but all having the benefit of the reading. And the impression produced on the old charwoman revealed itself in the remark with which she closed her account of it. "Lawk, Mom, I thought that 3 or 4 men must have put together Dombey." So even the people who couldn't read loved Dombey and Son. William Makepeace Thackeray, an important writer of a contemporary of Dickens, sometime friend, sometime enemy. He was a critic, both in a positive and negative sense. He, of course, wrote what is considered to be a very important novel, Vanity Fair. in the same kind of time frame as Oliver Twist and Dombey. Um, Interesting that Thackeray had his novel illustrated and serialized like Dickens, and unlike Dickens, Thackeray actually did his own illustrations. I may quarrel with Mr. Dickens's art 1,000 times. I delight and wonder at his genius. Thackeray, then at work on Vanity Fair, greeted the 5th number of Dombey and Son, the 5th month, with this comment, quote, "There's no writing against such power as this. One has no chance. Read that chapter describing young Paul's death. It is unsurpassed. It is stupendous." So now we turn to our last discussion of Oliver Twist, at least from my angle. We haven't talked about Monks, and Monks is certainly an interesting character. He kind of appears out of the blue. Some people kind of scratch their head and wonder how Dickens ever decided to insert the character into the novel. He does play an important role, and one can argue it's a kind of a turning point. This illustration is from an 1867 edition, not the original. And of course, Monks is an example of Dickens's use of the Gothic. We've talked about other themes that Dickens has used in his novel, Romanticism, the pastoral, melodrama, etc. And here's the Gothic. Basic definition of the Gothic is standard characteristics used to define Gothic literature include the supernatural, an environment of fear, and the intrusion of the past upon the present. In particular, in Twist, the present is being haunted by the past. In this illustration from the 1867 edition, Monks, whose real name is Edward Leeford, destroys the evidence of the marriage of Oliver's mother, evidence that he has just acquired from Bumble. And here's a quote from Monks in Twist. "In short, Fagin," he says, "Jew as you are, you never laid such snares as I'll contrive for my young brother Oliver." So he's plotting for of course he's plotting. I think this is the most bizarre, strange illustration in Oliver Twist. It's pretty creepy. It's entitled Reappearance of Monks and the Jew. And of course, this is an important piece of the story with showing Fagin and Monks working together to track down Oliver. And to quote Twist, "He, the other man, seemed to answer, 'Could I mistake him, think you? If a crowd of ghosts were to put themselves into his exact shape, and he stood amongst them, there is something that would tell me how to point him out. If you buried him 50 feet deep and took me across his grave, I fancy I should know if there wasn't a mark above it that he lay buried there." The man seemed to say this with such dreadful hatred that Oliver awoke with fear and started up. Kind of a nightmare. Again, all very Gothic. And of course, speaking of Gothic, Bill Sikes, the monster, always using fear and terror. Characters appear and disappear at will in the murky world of Whitechapel, governed by Fagin and Sikes. And after Sikes murders Nancy and he's on the run, here's a quote, which again illustrates the use of the Gothic. "At times he turned with desperate determination, resolved to beat this phantom off, though it should look him dead. But the hair rose on his head and his blood stood still, for it had turned with him and was behind him then." This painting is just that. It's a painting. It's not an illustration from any edition of Oliver Twist. And I used it because of the face of Bullseye. It's just kind of creepy and terrifying at the same time. The relationship between that dog and his so-called master. It's powerful. This should look familiar if you looked at the handouts for this last session. This is a cartoon broadside done by Cruikshank, of course, Oliver Twist's illustrator. It was done well before Twist. And of course, it gets at the threat of the countryside by the sprawl of urbanization and construction and technology. Doc gets a table slam because he's the one who came up with the title for this slide, which I just think is hilarious. Where have all the flowers gone? Of course, if you know your Peter, Paul, and Mary, then that should ring a bell to you. This cartoon broadside actually still is used by environmentalists in various articles to show how long the concern for the environment has been around, historically speaking. It also addresses, you know, as Doc did last time, the pastoral, in a sense, or the attack on the pastoral. So where are we at this point? Here are some summary concluding points that I've pulled together from all 6 presentations. And I would argue probably the most important ones from my perspective. Charles Dickens was an upwardly mobile member of Victorian England's middle class. The evolving middle class was emerging as a new force within Great Britain. And this is just a huge point from a historian's perspective. I mean, it's a game changer. The emergence of the middle class is going to change things, in some ways good, in some ways not so good, as a result throughout Europe, because it's going to be the middle class, as we'll see, who really picks up and becomes the driving force for revolutionary change on the continent following the revolutions of 1848. But it's already happening in England, and Dickens is an example. I mean, Dickens loves being middle class. He wants to protect his own wealth and gain more wealth. But at the same time, he has a reforming edge to him. And therein is the power of the middle class for change. Third bullet point, his initial foray into court and parliamentary reportage laid an important foundation for his future writing. Dickens' fiction served as a springboard for the debates about moral and social reform. I've already told you that London Times would publish excerpts from Oliver Twist, and that they had a direct impact on Parliament making changes to the workhouse laws as a result. Dickens's decision to both serialize and illustrate had a profound impact on the 19th century world's reading public. And I would add, too, also impacted the way authors were beginning to write, and some copying his serialization and illustration. This is a quote that I used in an earlier class, so it might sound familiar to you. And again, it's from Ackroyd, biographer of Dickens. Quote, Dickens opened the world for those who were already living in it. And what this has to do with is that he is opening the eyes of many people around him who can read, and even those who can't read, but who can listen and see the pictures and see things that they either took for granted or just never saw or never thought about. And Charles Dickens was one of his own complicated characters, both in public and in private. And this becomes even clearer when we get to the second set of classes. He's a complicated man, as most of us are. We're all flawed. Dickens, throughout his career, not just till 1849, creates over 2,000 characters. And again, this is what I think people admire him most for. And here's a quote again from Twist, which is a good summary quote. It is the custom on the stage in all good murderous melodramas to present the tragic and comic scenes in as regular alternation as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky bacon. Streaky bacon's a good metaphor here for the different styles and themes that he uses in Oliver Twist, as well in all his other novels, incorporating the Gothic, the pastoral, the melodrama, etc., etc. So next year, same time next year, we'll look at his final years and producing arguably one of the great masterpieces in English literature. But we're going to also look at the French Revolution as a historical moment, because it influences a lot of things throughout Europe, including England. And we'll look at Dickens's version of the French Revolution, and to see to what degree his novel covers fact and to what degree he fancifies things. So if you want to read a novel, get working on A Tale of Two Cities. So I want to thank you very much for following this course with me. I've enjoyed talking with you about the history of Dickens and Victorian England, and to some degree Oliver Twist, although that's Doc's side of things with his discussions of poetry and literature. So thank you very much, and I'll miss you, but hopefully I'll see you again. And now here's Doc.
AL.
Is there alliteration somewhere?
Allusion.
Allusion is what I was looking for. But it was great to see you there for a second. Okay. Yeah. Now, here's a question. It's a romantic poem. Okay. It's written in 1807. This is far before, Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. So how do you see it in Oliver Twist how do you see the sentiments of this poem being expressed in Oliver Twist, and yet how does Dickens take a different turn with poem? Not with the poem, but with the subject matter. Because this is pastoral. Okay, this is because sometimes the pastoral is sad because of the loss of this sort of idyllic world. So I guess what I'm getting at is, how does Dickens show that, yeah, he's got a little bit of romanticism in him, but it's not all that. It's not, this is, I mean, Oliver Twist is anything but a Wordsworthian novel.
So I think that similar to the poem, they're talking about, the hurrying and hustle and bustle of like city life, and that I think Dickens takes it as crime. It's all the theft and the deceit and the murder as sort of the horrible things in their sort of sordid boon of being in the city. But he redeems it in the end by having everything conclude in the country, by having everybody move out of the city, that like all the people who get their just desserts, hanging, dying, whatever, are all out of, in the city. And then the others are moved to the country where they can at least try to communicate again with nature. He sort of tries to bring them back to what Wordsworth is talking about.
Nicely said. Other comments about that?
No, Dickens doesn't say anything good about the city. There's never a nice description of life in the city. When you're reading, he does such a beautiful job of painting this picture of just crowds and filth and disease at every turn, and someone dangerous at every turn, the least of which are these little adorable pickpocketers. So, but when he does talk about all the redemption kind of happens in the country, that's where Oliver gets better, that's where he gets healthier. He's injured and then they bring him back to life, and he finds the kindness of Rose and all of that.
Yeah, that's really good, Jen. So the thing about it is, what do we remember? I mean, this is just obviously, these are my opinion. What do we remember about the novel? Do we remember the country, or do we remember the city?
Well, that's the thing for me, Peter. It seems to me, I agree with what Jennifer just said, but I am, when I read Oliver Twist, I am most moved and convinced, persuaded when he's describing life in the city. That's when he's the most authentic, I think. I'm the least convinced when we're in the countryside. I feel like I'm being manipulated when I'm with him in the country scenes, but I'm with him all the way when he's in the city. It may not be pretty, but it's authentic.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting.
I totally agree with that. The city feels fully three-dimensional and dirty and wrong and beloved. And the country seems like a very thin oil painting.
Yeah.
Well, nice. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, he does end it. I mean, after all, we end in this kind of rural bliss. But what he most powerfully, because face it, there are a lot of writers like Wordsworth, a lot of romantic poets who more specifically and I think more effectively describe the country, described nature than Dickens does. But you're absolutely right. He does make this decision. We're going to end this in the country. We're going to end this in a rural situation. And by the way, there's if we had all the world all the world in time, I would have included another poem by Wordsworth called Lines Composed Upon Westminster Bridge, which was included in the same collection of poems in 1807. And it's a it's a beautiful poem about early morning as Dickens looked over this almost idyllic London landscape. Not Dickens, excuse me. Wordsworth looks over this idyllic London landscape. And yet, we know what's the underbelly of it, right? And that's also another Petrarchan sonnet. So, how about talking about monks? I was reading this little guy named George Gissing, early 20th century writer, wrote a book about Dickens's works, and he found that monks was one of the most unsatisfactory characters in the book. So let's start with that. What do you think?
I think for me, it's hard to figure out how old Monks is. I can't understand. It seems like there's some sort of a time lapse somewhere because he's operating so criminally, and yet here's young Oliver is only 9 years old.
I think he's 12, isn't he? Is he 12? How old? Is he 12?
12.
12. Either way, I feel like there's a big gap between how old Monks is and how young Oliver is. And he's had time to put all this together. I can't really put an age on Monks is what I'm saying simply.
And it's also hard to put an age on Nancy, isn't it? Because of what essentially the world has done to her and maybe to him. He's not a physical specimen by any means, right? At all. Okay. More ideas. That's really good, Derek. More ideas.
His
I feel like
backstory seems contrived.
Contrived.
It's just like, oh, and like here's this guy who has an extremely convoluted story who somehow has like hated Oliver for forever because we needed someone to hate Oliver.
It seemed to me that Dickens was on a deadline and he needed to finish things up promptly. And so I really felt the heavy hand of an author in this case.
Okay, all right. More ideas about the character of Monks. I too tend to agree with this fellow Gissing and some of you. I think it's a contrived. It's a very it's a very strong character in a way. I mean, it's like he's really kind of freaky, you know, spooky.
I would say that it's more of a plot device than a character at all. And my own view is that there are only two characters in the novel that are memorable and convincing, and those are Fagin, by far, and Bill Sikes.
Mhm.
And I think you see the same thing in the David Lean movie, where you have Alec Guinness as Fagin. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. And Robert Newton as Sykes.
Yeah, and I think
And
there's
because people, it's a typical thing that people say that in Paradise Lost, Satan was the hero. It's easier to
God,
create
yeah.
evil characters than it is good.
Oh, God
Yeah,
is so boring in that
exactly.
poem.
And the Mayleys and even Oliver himself are utterly unreal, seems to me.
Okay. Other ideas? You can comment.
It's just that with monks, there's no redemption. I mean, he's given the opportunity, he goes to the new world, and then he dies in prison, or, you know, he reverts back to his same past.
That's really good. Yeah, there is no redemption. I mean, he's a classically flat character. And by the way, I'm not saying that this is bad. I'm just saying that that's kind of what it is. I mean, he's not a round character. But how do we mostly know about Monk? I think that Monks, I really like that show Monk, but anyway, Monks. How do we actually know about him? Primarily.
Mostly
We
through
hear
his
about him
interaction
through
with
other
Fagin,
people.
right?
Say what?
It's mostly through his interaction with Fagin.
Okay. How much is that where we find out most about him?
Isn't it when Brownlee comes back and kind of, he sends his people out to find the information, and he comes back and he basically tells Monks his whole story?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yes, we do have the interaction with Fagin, and we do have the interaction later with Brownlow. But in terms of the history, most of it is through exposition. It's, sort of those of you who were students of mine, I would always say show, don't tell. There's a hell of a lot of telling with Monks. Not too much showing. I mean, some vivid portrayals, like him at the window looking into Oliver's room, and his discussions with like Brownlow. But even there, he's sort of explaining things. Okay, whereas the other characters are showing us through dialogue, through physical description. I mean, there is a kind of interesting physical description of him. If you turn to 387. Look at the top of the page. And this, of course, is the description of Monks by Nancy. Well, go to the bottom of 386. He is tall, said the girl, and a strongly made man, but not stout. He has a lurking walk, and as he walks, constantly looks over his shoulder, first on one side and then on the other. Don't forget that, for his eyes are sunk in his head so much deeper than any other man's that you might almost tell him by that alone. His face is dark, like his hair and eyes, but although he can't be more than 6 or 8 and 20, withered and haggard. His lips are often discolored and disfigured with the marks of teeth, for he has desperate fits and sometimes even bites his hands and covers them with wounds. Why did you start? The girl stopped and said, what's being described here?
Yes, epilepsy, I think.
He has epilepsy, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has epilepsy. And what else of this description? And again, this is exposition. You know, we're told what he looks like, and that's been one of the most powerful things in the novel, right? When we're told what Fagin looks like, what Rose looks like, you know, what are the key elements that you see in this description?
The sunken eyes that are so deep in his head.
Mm-hmm.
That's really graphic.
Mm-hmm.
Lurking walk.
Yeah. And even though he's only 26 or 28, he's withered and haggard. And then there's this red mark. Upon his throat. Now, you know, I don't know what the red mark means, but what do you think? Why does he have this red mark?
Mark of the devil.
Ah, yeah, it's gotta be, right?
Oh,
I feel
And
like he's the
usually
driving
the
force.
mark on your throat is where someone tried to hang you.
say what?
Usually the red mark on your throat is that someone tried to hang you and you got out of it.
But this is on his face. On his cheek, I thought he said. I could be
Was it
wrong.
on his cheek? Upon his
On
throat.
his throat. So
Oh, okay, sorry.
high, you can see part of it
Like- yeah.
below his neckerchief when he turns his face. Broad and red mark, yeah. Well, so Bevan, so what are you going to do with that?
It's just saying like, oh, this is a criminal.
This is as bad as it gets.
This is as bad as it gets, right? This is
Why would
not a
he
good
make?
person.
Why would Dickens make him epileptic? Now, I have to admit, I have no idea how epilepsy was viewed in Victorian times. It's my fault. But why would Dickens make him epileptic?
Could some of his physical characteristics have been the manifestation that he was consumed with revenge?
Well,
That the
mm,
whole purpose of his life was to get revenge on Oliver.
that's it. And that, yeah, I didn't think of that, but that seems really good. Yeah. Other ideas?
I was thinking that jeez. I was thinking that the red mark was really just like the surefire way that it's definitely him. Like, you know, we don't have records, we don't have driver's licenses or social security numbers or, you know, CCTV, but the red mark, and I took it as like a birthmark.
Uh-huh.
So it was, you know, and maybe it like Gorbachev's, you know, very distinctive in its shape or something like that. So it's
Though
like,
I like Gorbachev better than I like, you know.
Hey,
fair
Doc,
enough.
Yeah.
epilepsy was seen as a demonic possession in
Whoa.
Victorian times.
I was
Thank you.
also going to say that, but Kendall interrupted me.
Listen,
Sorry, Sarah.
listen, Swakos, you've gotten enough damn table slaps.
Well,
in a
keep it
couple-
quiet over here. But I was wondering, I was like, it sounds like sort of possessed by the devil, right? Because you're flailing,
Yeah.
you're out of control.
Yes.
Your eyes are rolling back in your head.
Yeah, that's
so
really, really
consumed
good.
by your passions that you can't even control your body.
Mm.
If on page 308 through 09 too, there's a lot of the talk about devil and hell associated with monks. I mean, I feel like he's like the undercurrent of this whole book of evil percolating sort of at the bottom and then just rising up to
You want
affect
to read some
everybody
of
else.
that stuff? Why don't you read some of it?
Right, let me switch over to that 308, 309. It's when he's with the Bumbles.
While Ginny's
Yeah.
looking for that, also,
Yeah,
I
okay.
remember Fagin is seen as a devil-like figure as well,
Yes.
both in illustration as in, well, you know, holding the pitchfork and things.
But it almost seems to me, Kendall, that Monks has I mean, Kendall Fagin at least has a few moments, you know, where he's like, playing around with the kids, whereas Monk seems so completely evil. So anyway, Jenny, what were you looking at?
So in the middle of like 309, he starts to talk about, hear it, he cried, shrinking back, hear it rolling and crashing away as if it echoed through 1,000 caverns where the devils are hiding from it. Fire the sound, I hate it. And he's talking about, having one of his fits. He said, these fits come over me now and then, and thunder sometimes brings them on. Don't mind me now, it's all over at once. But there's also a part I was trying to find on 3.8 where they talk about hell, and unfortunately I don't have great light here. I'm so having a hard time reading.
Is that, yeah? Oh, I see it. Cooling yourselves in the middle of 308. Is this it?
Yes, there it is. Yep. Cooling yourselves, right? As much as
monks.
hell's fire out of a man. That was an interesting way he phrased that, right? Cooling yourselves, retorted Monks. Not that all the rain that ever fell or ever will fall will put as much of hell's fire out as a man can carry about with him. You won't cool yourself so easily. Don't think it. So he's like got hellfires in him, and you could stand in rain all day. He's not going to stop that.
Yeah. Very, very good. So if we may, I mean, I think we received permission to go a little longer if we need to, but is that correct, or am I wrong?
You're making that up, Doc.
Well, I have a hopeful heart.
Keep hoping.
Let's go to Bill Sykes at the end. His murder of Nancy is horrendous. Well described on 396. What happens to him? And why does Dickens have it happen to him?
He gets haunted.
The phantoms of what he did. Okay. Why does Dickens do that? That's another way of asking, why does he give Bill a kind of a chance at redemption? Why Bill?
Why does even Bill get a conscience?
Yeah, why? Does he deserve it?
Bill's kind of a victim as well of society and, the city and the state of the world, whereas Monks was born into privilege and hasn't had to fight for everything he has. It was kind of handed to him.
That's, yeah. See, I've got to move my drink. Yeah, that's a table slam right there. Yeah. Other ideas?
Well, Nancy loved Bill and she stayed with him, and she even, gave up the opportunity for her salvation to be with him. And so we have to have some redeeming factor in Bill that would balance Nancy's love for him.
Yeah, even if we don't see it very often. Though he does give her credit for sort of like, hey, she's the one who takes care of me. When he's talking to Fagin, right? Okay. So he's been redeemed in a certain way. But then he almost, on page 406, he almost kills his dog. Like that's a big no-no to me. You don't, dogs are frequently better than people. Okay, so if, why do that? And then why does he die the way he dies at the end? And poor Bullseye, jumps. Well, I mean, it's, he's a good dog, but he's kind of stupid. Jumps off, the roof to join his master. Why do that? Why have him die? I mean, if he's been redeemed, why then have him die?
I don't think he was redeemed. I mean, he murdered her in a horrible, vicious way, and he was a terrible person, and all the things he did to Oliver. leaving him in a ditch when he was shot and all of that. He has to go. I mean, in Dickens' world, at least for the most part, people who are bad have got to go. I mean, they've got to get their
but wait a minute,
comeuppance, whatever that
he
is.
helps out. He helps out with the fire.
Yeah.
I'm
I mean, oh hey, how are you?
sorry. I
You
also
don't-
think that I know I'm still here. I am listening to everything. Sorry. I also think though that sometimes like because he is a little bit redeemed and he actually does seem to have an inkling that he knows what is wrong. Now that he knows that, he can't live anymore. Like he can't unknow that, and so
Wow.
he has to die.
I like
Which is
that.
too
I
much.
like that.
I don't know. Thank
Okay,
you.
I like that. You're welcome.
I'm gonna
You're
mute
welcome.
myself again.
Other
It's also
ideas?
the cause of his own undoing, Doc, right? I mean, basically, he hangs himself by accident. Right? And at the end of the day, he was his own worst enemy from the beginning.
Yeah.
There
I
was
mean,
really
we don't want him to live, right? I'm just saying that's the way I feel. It's sort of like, as my mom used to say, God bless her, good riddance to bad rubbish, right? I mean, it's like, what the hell is, he killed Nancy, and it's fine, good. I'm glad that he felt some guilt, glad that he helped at the fire, but he's better off dead.
I actually read it that Bullseye jumps into his master's arms to be a little bit more weight on his hanging neck. Actually, that's how I read it.
Whoa.
I'm thinking Bullseye is, more of the weight that will actually kill
Trying to
Bill,
finish the
even
job.
though.
Wow. Nice. All right. Wow. I mean, it's too bad this is the last night. I mean, you people are smoking.
It may also suggest that evil is punished, and there's no escaping from it. It seems to be an accident, but it's an act of providence. All the evil people are punished. Again, another unrealistic view, part of Dickens, that nobody gets away with anything.
And I guess the key thing there, Eric, is the way that he's defining evil, right? Because obviously the Dodger is not evil. The Dodger is a criminal kid who, is probably better off, as we've said before, with Fagin than a lot of other, poor orphan kids his age. I mean, there's at least some sense of, and I say this ironically, family, but there is. I
don't think anything bad happens to Mr. Crackett either.
Right. Why do you think that is?
And
what about Charlie Bates?
yeah,
Hunky
he
chickly.
ends up kind of okay, only
He
Still
becomes like a
slightly evil.
shepherd. He becomes like Mr. Pastoral, right? But there's a reason for that. Why is it? Why does Charlie Bates turn out okay?
He's the one who really, calls out the criminality of what's going on around him and
Excellent.
changes his ways.
Excellent. There it is. So and I think the point is, sure. Okay, so he earns it, right? He earns it. The Dodger, I mean, he was a little criminal, but that's okay. He gets sent away, and that's fine. He doesn't have to muck up the world of London anymore. But and then also, when we learn of Rose and Rose's past, which again comes through exposition, we're told. Isn't she pretty much Oliver, who happened to have been luckier earlier? What do you think?
I give you a table slap, Doc.
Who gave me that?
It's Sarah. I felt like I
Sarah.
had enough I could give.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very appreciative of that. So it's a pretty tidy ending, isn't it? I mean, the good guys win for the most part. Nancy, of course, suffers the worst possible fate, but in the end, the good guys win. And
Doc, the people who didn't know who they were find out who they are. I think that's important too. Like the parentage, Rose, who thought she had been illegitimate and was not good enough for the man who loved her, and that idea of finally knowing who you are.
Really good, really good. So then, tell me why the last. I mean, this is not in contradiction to what you said, but it's just a question. If you go to the very last page of the novel, I'll read it. I'll read the last paragraph, and then we'll tell me why it ends this way. Within the altar of the old village church, there stands a white marble tablet which bears as yet but one word, Agnes. There's no coffin in that tomb, and may it be many, many years before another name is placed above it. But if the spirits of the dead ever come back to earth to visit spots hallowed by the love beyond the grave of those whom they knew in life, I do believe that the shade of that poor girl often hovers about that solemn nook. Though it is a church, and she was weak and errant. I just love that. Why? Really, he could have ended.
I thought that last part was very much what Kendall talked about Mary Hogarth dying and her spirit of love always being with him. I thought that was a tribute, after learning that's a tribute to her at the end of the book. But also reminding us too about Agnes being erring, so that we remind you that it's not a good thing in Victorian times for a girl to be having a baby, out of wedlock to somebody she thought she was married to, and
really good. And it's also a perfect way to close. It begins with Agnes giving birth to Oliver, and it ends with Agnes. It's sort of, we bring that.
Brings it full circle.
Full circle, you got it.
It's also a very.
Also with Fagin, when he's the last night of his life, and he is realizing how many people that he sent to the gallows, and then mocking them that they had prayers on their lips, and now it's his turn, and he is desperate and prayerful as well.
Yeah, good.
It's also a very poetic paragraph. It's a beautifully constructed sentence.
It is.
It's a complicated or complex sentence, but it's hauntingly beautiful.
Yeah.
And very satisfying. It's the tying up all the loose ends is both somehow it's both satisfying and not satisfying. It's satisfying in the sense that, okay, now it's all wrapped up, we've got all the answers, everyone's sorted out, but it's not satisfying in the sense that that's really not how life is at all. And so it's although it's not realistic, it's nice to wrap it all up.
Yeah, I was reading today somebody who said, one of the primary goals of fiction writers in the 19th century rather, and this is to me, anything I read, I want to have a good story, and what they were after was to tell a good story. And the relative realism of it was not all that important.
Right.
But the story, it's a hell of a story. I mean, I love that book. I love that back. And I, can point to how the hell does this happen? But it doesn't matter. It's still, a wonderful book.
I do have a question about Dickens' readings when he would go and orate his stories. How much did he cover? Because in reading, when I was reading, sometimes I actually found it very helpful to stop, slow down, and say a sentence out loud.
Well, Kendall
Because it
knows
is so
more
bad.
about this than I do, but he was an actor. He was an actor. So so do you want to add something to that, Kendall?
Again, remember, it's serialized. So they're only getting 3 chapters a month. So these were read and reread and reread over and over again and passed around. So you had lots of time, and there are no other, how many other distractions are there? There's no television, there's no radio, podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. So
We got gin.
that gin.
All right, you got one for that, Bevan, even though it's not really deserved. Okay.
But other than reading, not that that's I don't want to cheapen it. I mean, reading's what they did if they could, and even if they couldn't, they listened. And we open up a whole new chapter next time when we talk about him going on stage and reading, because in a way that's where he really reaches his superstardom and is able to act as he always wanted to.
So how much did he actually, like, of a novel, like when he did Oliver Twist, right, in performance? How long?
It varies. I mean, it's well cataloged. We know exactly what he performed, when he performed, who he performed to. Sometimes he would just do Christmas Carol. Sometimes he would do. Christmas Carol was performed more than any other, and Nancy and Sykes' murder scene was number 2.
Okay,
but
not all of Christmas Carol.
But Nancy and Sykes' murder scene partly killed him. And again, I don't, we'll get into this in more detail later, but they didn't want him to do it. They being his inner circle, because they knew what it was doing to him. But we have to say sayonara.
Thank you,
Heather.
Kendall, for all you've done. We all appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much. It
thanks
was
to
terrific.
all of you. It's been so damn much fun.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Next up in the fall will be the Great War, 1914, 1918. Planned over a year ago, but it seems a bit timely right now, unfortunately.
Thank you both.
So much for letting us be a part of GA again.
Thank you.
Glad
Thank
you're
you.
here. We'll see you
Thanks,
again.
everyone.
Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Take
Thank
care of
you.
yourself.
Bye. Thank you.
Safe.